Thank you very much, Sterling. Let me get this thing rolling. And we could have there we are. He introduced my title as Manipulating Science, Sloppy Work. He said it was scientific malfeasance. On the advice of my attorney, I've changed that to scientific bias instead of malfeasance, because, and actually it was on the advice of David Gates. So thank you, David. I think I'll, I'm going to talk today. I wanted to do something different, and I was thinking what it was. And one of the things, as I was researching my next book, one of the things that struck me, I had a section in it, it's in 3 parts. The first section is on unusual and unprecedented warming. And as I was going through and researching the evidence, I was just struck by just the horrible, horrible science that's being used to justify this notion of unusual and unprecedented warming. Just time after time, truncations, manipulating data, cherry picking, creating data, using data upside down. So I thought it might be good to just look through just quickly the highlights, or maybe we call it the lowlights, of some of these big, what were called replication studies supporting Michael Mann's hockey stick. And then I'll throw in a couple of the alarmism masquerading as science at the end. So of course I'm not going to deal too much on the hockey stick. Michael Mann kicked this off with this notion of unusual and unprecedented warming. 900 years of slowly declining temperature. Of course, we're all familiar with this. And then escalating temperatures alarmingly going into the 20th century. And this is really an important discussion that we have to have, because if indeed temperatures are unusual and unprecedented over the scale of thousands of years, and something we haven't seen in thousands of years, that would lend great support to the notion that CO2 is driving temperature increases over the last 80 or 90 years. If, on the other hand, our temperatures today aren't unusual, they're not unprecedented, but rather we see, in particular the medieval warm period, that it's actually as warm or warmer than today, then that's a strong argument backing those of us that support nature being the primary driver of temperature changes. And what we see, as I look through all of these studies going one way or the other, the errors and the mistakes that were made all go in one direction. They reduce the warming of the medieval warm period and increase the temperature of the Little Ice Age. What are the odds of that happening? Not very good, for all the mistakes to go in one direction. So the big pushback on this, of course, came from Steve McIntyre, aided by Ross McKittrick, this dates back, Mann's papers from 98 and 99. They came back and just blew it up and identified a huge amount of mistakes in Michael Mann's work, truncation of data, obsolete data, just a litany of things, one after another, just horrible mistakes within these studies. Two of the biggest things that Michael Mann used for the hockey stick was incorrect statistical methods in analyzing the statistical data that tended to produce hockey sticks no matter what the data was inputted, which would be a good boon. If you want to create hockey sticks, you need a statistical method that generates them. And the second big thing that we see repeated in a lot of the replication studies of his work is this reliance on invalid proxy data, in particular strip bark chronologies of tree ring data, mostly bristlecone pines. And this reliance on the bristlecone pine ring data, the authors of that study, Graybill and Idso, they stated in their very study that the tree ring increase, which Mann interpreted as being related to temperature, was actually related to increases in CO2. But he used it anyhow. And again, we see the same chronology used time and time again after that. It's been their work, McIntyre and McKittrick's work, was backed up in 2 big studies. The Congressional Wegman report said that McIntyre and McKittrick's arguments were compelling and valid. And also they backed it up. They said that modern warming cannot be supported by his analysis. This is an actual congressional report that was done. And then Dr. Michael Fox said, we're either dealing with willful scientific deceptions or woeful and lazy scientific mediocrity from PhDs themselves. This is relating to the people talking about the hockey stick. But it's a recurring theme. After the hockey stick, there were a number of what are called replication studies. In other words, they replicated more hockey sticks. Most of those, I'm going to break them up in, there are really two classifications. There are the early replication studies in the 2000s, early 2000s, late 2000s. Then we go into the 2010, 2013. Those are later replication studies, the pages 2K. But a lot of these still rely on the same flawed tree ring proxies. And tree rings are okay to use as a proxy. A lot of you are very knowledgeable, but just for those of you who aren't, you can use, what you want to do with a tree ring, if you're going to use it for temperature, you want to do it in the very high latitudes where it's cold or the very high altitudes where it's cold. So you want, apologies to Jimmy Buffett, so it's talking about changes in latitudes, changes in altitudes for these. So, but if you don't do that, there are other things that drive tree ring growth data. The big thing with this, too, is we see with the people that use dendrochronology or tree rings, they're able to cherry pick the data. And what they can do is pick out the tree ring data that suits their purposes. And if you find tree rings that go against modern warming, well, you just get rid of those. Roseanne Dorigo famously said, you have to pick cherries if you want to make cherry pie. And they're very kind of proud of this. So obviously, if these tree rings don't agree with modern day warming, oh, there must be something wrong with the data. And Steve McIntyre calls this ex post screening. So what they do is look at large data sets and then only cull out the tree ring data that supports this notion of unusual and unprecedented warming. So the ability to choose and pick which samples to use is an advantage unique to dendrochronology. So if you can pick the data set closely and just pick out the ones that show unusual and unprecedented warming, I think you'll tend to get unusual and unprecedented warming. And finally, Gordon Jacoby, he admitted, he says, if we get a good climactic story from a chronology, we write a paper using it, that's our funded mission. So that's where the funding's driving this. And then we get to replicating the hockey stick. You see all these headlines, largest warming in 2,000 years, 1,000 years, whatever it is. They gather headlines. And a lot of these early replication studies, the studies' names are at the top, the various proxy data is on the left, and the red boxes are the ones used. Well, a lot of these were just, if we went through, and in the book I'm going through detailing what was wrong with each of these studies that they used to document this. And many of these were used, and most of these were used in the same study after study. If we took, for example, the polar Urals, we just looked at, and that's the top one there. It was used in all of these early studies. Well, the first one, this is what was used. This is the polar Ural study data of tree rings, showing that the medieval warm period was the coldest over in 1,000 years. It was Steve McIntyre looked at it and he said, looks just like really bad data and it should never have been used. That was confirmed with an updated study adding 20 years of data. That in fact, the good data that was recovered showed that actually the medieval warm period was the warmest in 1,000 years or more. The other one that was used in all the studies was called Tornatrask. And again, it was an era, just a bad data set that was used. And again, Steve McIntyre is a hero to me. He was the one who went and discovered most of these problems. But they can continue to use one flawed study after another. The Pages 2K network, it stands for Past Global Changes. It's the de facto wing of the hockey team. So you've probably, if you've not seen the studies themselves, you've seen the headlines in the paper. The first one was in 2013. Again, unusual and unprecedented warming. They looked at 7 continent-wide reconstructions, and here are 6 of the 7. I want you to look close. I'm going to leave this up for just a little bit. I want you to look at 6 of the 7 continent-wide reconstructions. Do any of those look unusual or unprecedented to you? They don't to me, not a one of them. But yet, the overall reconstruction that he did of global temperatures showed a hockey stick with unusual and unprecedented warming, and that's because that was being driven by the Arctic data, which is shown here, which shows a clear hockey stick. When we went back, Steve McIntyre went back and looked at it. For number one, it was really being driven by 2 studies. Handjarvi from Iceland took the data and used it upside down. So instead, yes, they turned the data completely upside down, and of course, what should have been cold was now warm, what should have been warm is now cold. The other was a Galliku Lake sediment, that's in Greenland. That's actually Eric the Red lived close to where that building is right there. The lake sediments are used. The theory is that during really cold times, snow builds up for a long time over the winter. There's a large snow accumulation, and then in the spring we have much larger runoff, and there's more sediment in the lake. Well, in this case, they didn't take into account modern farming. There's a couple of things you can do, too, to increase sediment. For example, I call it the Viking bump. You see right kind of in the middle there. That's when Eric the Red and the rest of his buddies started farming along the edge of this lake. And of course, if you're farming, you're going to get more sediment. And then we have the modern day agricultural practices that the study they used actually said that's what's causing this. When he went back and reevaluated this, the top one was the original, showing the unusual and unprecedented warming in the hockey stick. The bottom, they actually had to publish, I'm not sure an incorrectum. Will Happer will correct me there, but or David, but they published a correction to this. This is the corrected data on the bottom. Again, we see the Little Ice Age. We see a medieval warm period, and we see warming today. But the temperatures during the medieval warm period were warmer than they are today. And this is the final reconstruction of that data. Again, showing warmer today, which we're in a warming trend. I think we all admit that. But it shows nothing unusual about the warming that we're in. Nothing compared to the medieval warm period. But you remember whenever this was published, there were huge headlines screaming unusual, nothing like this has been seen in thousands of years. Of course, the correction was buried and no one ever saw it. One of the worst ones is the Marcotte reconstruction that's shown. I see it on Facebook a lot in media. This thing's posted, just horrible, horrible. My friend Willie Soon here has talked about it. But Marcotte published his PhD dissertation, which is at the bottom, showing no unusual warming. He published Reconstruction a couple years later, showing a huge warming, global temperature highest in 4,000 years. Willie Soon came out. They used the Australian Cicero used this study to document something. Dr. Soon came out, said trying to say this paper is legitimate and can be used as supporting scientific evidence is scientific malpractice. So again, we see time after time, and he relied on this unusual and unprecedented warming to one data point, and actually in the actual data, it never even showed up. The one data point driving this wasn't even in the data provided. The later Pages 2K relied heavily on tree ring data. That first one we looked at, Pages 2013, used tree ring data. He took 124 of the samples of tree rings that were used in the first study and just erased them. And the reasoning was they're flawed. They have to be flawed because they're not showing warming, modern warming. All right, what do you do when something doesn't agree with your data? The solution too many times is just get rid of it. Kaufman 2020, one of the more recent ones. Again, now they're up to 6,500 years of cooling. We've never seen anything like this in that time frame. One of the things driving this was this Dahl-Jensen data that was used. He used it upside, he took the data on the left is from Dahl Jensen's study, and these are the years on the left. He took that data, inverted it, and then posted it into the modern data. That was documented, and that's what drove, that's why those two curves look so dissimilar. The one on the left is the original Dahl Jensen data. The one on the right, again from Steve McIntyre, is the data that was used in the study. Just horrific abuses, and I'll quickly go through this here. The other thing we look at, there's so many of these studies, and I'll pick out two of them that just jumped out at me. I think Patrick Moore will talk about it tonight, but the UN reported there'd be 1 million species at risk of extinction. Well, that would require 25,000 to 30,000 species to go extinct every single year over the next several decades. And this is the chart they included in the report, the UN report, looking pretty alarming. That looks pretty scary to me, but look closely. There are only 5 data points. They took 1 data point per century to create this chart. Well, I went back and actually looked at the same data. I looked at it on a decadal basis. I gathered it every 10 years to look at this, to find that extinctions peaked in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And since the late 1800s, extinctions have been in significant decline. Remember, the UN said we're going to have 25,000 to 30,000 species go extinct every year. You know what it's been for the last 40 years? 2. Not 2,000, not 200. 2 species have gone extinct according to the IUCN Red List. Completely different. They didn't manipulate the data. What they did was abuse the statistical methodology to get the result they wanted. And then just finishing up here, the 4th National Climate Assessment dealt with fire. This is the chart they used to support it. Area burned looks pretty alarming to me. And there was no source of reference in this National Climate Report. I went back, I found where it was coming from. It was the National Interagency Fire Center data. What they did was cherry pick the last several decades of data. Instead of showing the entire chart, they cherry picked that data and then increased the y-axis to make it look even worse. And when we talk about misconduct in science, this is what National Academies of Science have to say about misconduct. I'm not accusing any of these scientists referenced here of having misconduct, but they need to be a little bit more careful with their data and how they use it. And again, just finishing up here, I encourage you to go to the new CO2 Coalition website. We've got a lot of great data there. So thank you very much, and I appreciate your time.